computer. Hello everyone, this is our 9th session for Project Healing Wise, and got the recording going. I just need to go to my notes now, give me a moment. Yeah, I want to open the session with a quote, and that quote is by Nelson Mandela. He said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children." And that is what this dialogue is going to be all about today. So, quick reminder about the mission vision for our group Healing Wise. This is a closed group on Facebook, and it's dedicated to providing spiritual outreach work for children really all over the world and in all sorts of situations using a shamanic toolkit. Though today's session, as you'll find out, it's going to be a little bit more different. It's going to have more of a wider and pragmatic focus. And I also just want to say that for all of last year, I was doing monthly sessions for Healing Wise, but that got quite full on and people got very busy with all the extra demands of lockdowns and the pandemic. So we're still doing sessions, and when there is a theme and an amazing speaker, I absolutely go for it, but I'm not doing monthly sessions anymore. So these sessions will appear, as and when. So that's it for Healing Wise. We have a very special guest for today here on the Healing Wise show, and that is Katharine HAWORTH. Hello, Katharine. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Imelda.
So let me just introduce her. Katharine is a shamanic practitioner, a witch, a shamanic doula and celebrant, particularly working with womb healing, women's sacred cycles. She is a red tent facilitator, and she works with reclaiming the divine feminine and the magic of everyday life, which she considers our birthright. She's a mother to 4 beautiful children, and she says that the birth of her first child was a great shamanic awakening. I'm sure she'll talk about that herself in a moment. And like me, she feels that her children are her greatest teachers. Katharine worked for almost 2 decades, trained and worked as a person-centered therapist. She spent about 8 years in a crisis service, and she's also worked for a young people's charity as a counselor, supervisor, and manager. So is that a fair representation of your background, Katharine? Anything I've left out?
No, I think that was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go in then. So our conversation today is going to be going with what Nelson Mandela said. If the way that we treat our children shows the soul of our society, then I think there is work to be done. And unfortunately, the mental health statistics for young people were already deeply worrying even before the pandemic, and I've actively kept an eye on that as part of my own work. But, sadly, the figures have soared since the year of lockdowns and, pandemic, all the effects of the pandemic, and it's totally interrupted young people's lives. So Katharine and I just want to, say up front that our society will face huge challenges related to children, also to other groups in society. I want to acknowledge that as well. But our conversation today is about children and young people. So even after we get a handle on the virus, and even after the medical stress eases considerably, that's not going to mean that, we're like back to normal. Presumably there's going to be a new kind of normal. But also there will be long-term after effects from the pandemic rippling out in all sorts of directions. And we think, Katharine and I, that it's going to take all of us to make a difference in terms of what happens there. So that's what we're trying to talk to all of you by making this recording. And, we also want to make this recording ultimately uplifting and positive. So we're going to be sharing our own ideas about what can be done, and not only focus on what cannot be done, but we also want to be realistic and just sort of acknowledge what the situation is like. So here we also have to say that domestic abuse, at least here in the UK, possibly all over the world, has increased. And of course, for many children, school is their safe place. That's where they go and they get a break from the pressure cooker. That is their home life. And we have to bear in mind that especially those children who are not actually feeling safe at home, for them home is not a safe place, at the moment have no physical access to teachers and to friends. And of course, if your teacher is like a little icon on a screen, it's also much harder for those teachers to monitor what really goes on with children, but to be fully present to those children. Or say, if a child is going to have even more bruises than normal, the teacher is unfortunately not going to see that on the Zoom screen. So also just to sort of acknowledge of how serious this situation is. And sorry, I'll hand it over to Katharine in a moment, but I just wanted to mention one other thing. There was a tweet on Twitter recently, which really, hit me quite hard, and also really makes a statement about this pandemic. And this is a mother, I won't identify her, who has a teenage daughter who is self-harming at the moment, who's doing cutting. But she also said that until mental health services come back up and like real support for her daughter is available, it's not actually realistic to say stop cutting. The daughter is doing the cutting as a way of coping with a insurmountable situation. So what this mother had done, she had made a safe cutting box for her daughter, bandages and disinfectant and like a clean scalpel, and the philosophy being, if you now absolutely have to do this, like as a way of coping with your mental health, do it safely and don't pick up an additional infection along the way. But the fact that, and she will not be the only mother, she's probably the only mother who tweets about it on Twitter, and I really encourage, or I really admire her bravery and her courage. But she will not be the only parent who's in this situation. So again, another thing to be aware of. So anyway, that's it from me. Katharine, as someone who has professionally worked with young people in crisis, could you give a brief description of the issues that young people already faced before the pandemic, and then also say something about how things would have changed for those children and young people over the course of the year we've just lived through, please?
So in my experience, Imelda, I would say that young people very much face exactly the same issues as adults. This can range from anxiety, abuse, neglect, living with fear, relationship issues that can be with family, with friends, with partners, with teachers, any range of financial issues, housing issues, terrifying issues like domestic abuse, rape, child abuse, drugs and alcohol within the home, issues like you've described with self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and sadly for some children, involvement in child sexual exploitation, which are all issues that I've worked with extensively. I would say the huge difference for children is that they have got far less autonomy over their own lives than adults. So as you've already touched on, if a child is living in a situation of domestic abuse, they may have no access to a phone, they may have no access to the internet. So some of the things that may have helped to keep them safe, to bring them rhythm, routine, safety, to have a safe person there, have been very systematically ripped away from them. And I would say that especially in my experience at the crisis centre and the young people's counselling service, the type of sessions that happened where a young person was free and safe to open up in a completely non-judgmental space to a trusted and safe adult and to tell them exactly what was happening, that is not something, sadly, that can be replicated over Zoom. So if a child is in an abusive situation, they cannot, it's not safe to make such a call with an abuser in the house. And we've seen, like you've already pointed out, the levels of domestic abuse going up kind of exponentially. Alongside, we've got a reported suicide rate that it's now over 200% increase in suicide, and that's just the reported suicides.
A doubling since the pandemic came, just to be clear. That is the doubling in the suicide rate in young people since, let's say, a year ago, which is shocking. That's shocking.
Yeah. And I think that the lack of that actual safe physical space, and the lack of acknowledgement that people who provide therapy in whatever setting are actually essential workers, as well as, you know, as much as medical staff or teachers. The people who provide a safe and therapeutic space, if we are to value emotional and mental well-being, as we say we do for young people and children, then those spaces need to be viewed as essential. And as you've touched on, they haven't been.
They don't count as frontline workers, do they? That's the thing. They don't have the status of frontline workers. And we all know what that means. If you're not a frontline worker, you cannot come to work. So, you know, just like think of that sort of, you know, children who are already in a difficult situation, who more than ever need access to a teacher they trust, or another person they trust, or at least seeing their friends and having time away from that environment. Not only are they not getting the time out, they're not getting the access to their friends, to teachers and other safe people. And really, they're not being monitored. Like, no one really sees what goes on with them, because, you know, a teacher with 30 kids on Zoom is not going to see that on the little screens.
Absolutely. And with the best will in the world, I would say that a lot of these children, we're not necessarily talking about children who are being systematically and horrifically abused, but children, for example, who are young carers, who at home, they've got significant caring responsibilities, and potentially from a very loving home, but that they won't be getting the break that they usually get, where they can just be involved in childhood and childhood matters. And I think as well, I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
I can give you another question soon. I just want to tag on to that, and also just acknowledge that it works the other way as well. They're like parents who have severely disabled or severely autistic children. And normally, as I understand it, like from parents that I'm friends with or know, is that, you know, their lives have a rhythm where the child goes to school or sometimes like other daycare services, so the parent gets a break and gets to sort of refresh themselves or do an adult activity, so they can then go back in and be a carer. But also we now have children with severe disabilities and very high care needs, or with very, very destructive behavior, like, you know, considerable behavioral issues just at home the whole time, and the parents aren't getting a break. And you can just like ask yourself, you know, what impact that's going to have on those parents, however committed and wonderful they are. But that's not an easy situation to be in. Like, you know, who can do that 24/7, not even knowing when the situation is going to end? So all of these things, I said, not to, you know, if you were painting a dire picture here, but also if you're listening to this recording, and if you're either like a loving parent or you're in a family with essentially like good parents who provide for you and all of it, you may sort of think, oh, lockdown isn't great, but it isn't too bad. We're really trying to describe, you know, like lockdown has been bad for all of us, no doubt. It's not been good for anyone's mental health, as far as I can tell. But for children like who were already, you know, like so on the edge and so vulnerable, please just imagine for a moment what it's done to those children, but also to those parents and to those carers. We're now dealing with like, you know, insurmountable burdens without the help that they need. So, yeah, you know. Okay, go ahead.
There was just one thing that had kind of come to the forefront of my mind, and it was an article that I read very recently that left me actually in floods of tears, where a little boy was living in the 12th story of a high-rise flat, and his mother had fled from domestic abuse. So she, you know, she was in no way abusive or a neglectful woman, and she didn't have English as a first language. And when her little boy was logging on to do his classroom activity, he didn't actually get to see his teacher's face, and the teacher didn't get to see his face. So he would type in the morning, "Here, miss." The whole lesson would go by, and at the end of the lesson, he would say, "Bye, miss." And he didn't feel comfortable or confident enough to say that he hadn't understood the content from beginning to end. And then he would just go back to this kind of really rather secluded life with a mother who was already traumatized. And that really, really struck me as being, those children could be very easy to miss, you know, very easy to fall through the gaps. So something is being provided for him, but it's not hitting home. It's not reaching him in any meaningful way.
No, exactly. Yeah, no, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? And also, yeah, you know, just saying again that for those children who had mental health problems, that, you know, the waiting lists were unbelievably long even before lockdown and the pandemic, and it will be longer now. And, you know, when you have a child in crisis and you are the concerned parent desperately trying to get the help your child needs, to then be sort of told that the waiting list was 6 months before lockdown, and that may now have gone up to 18 months. 18 months is way too long for a person in crisis, you know. So, yeah, so just...
I've got a very small visitor who wants to say hello.
All right. Have Luna.
Okay, then you must go out because Mummy's, it's been recorded. Go on. Because we're done it. Yes, just go.
Hi, Luna. Nice to see you briefly.
Goodbye. Downstairs, Luna. Just one very quick second. I'm going to call in some assistance. Mom?
Okay, so Katharine is at her parents' house at the moment. So I know that a grandparent, you know, she's very lucky to have that. Grandparent will now be asked to be on the job. So here we just sort of see a demonstration of how enormously fortunate you are if you can ask your grandparents to do that for you.
Absolutely. I'm very, very grateful for that assistance.
Oh, yes. You are blessed. So, Katharine, let's then talk about you and your children for a moment. You are a single parent of 4 children. Thankfully, you're not without support. You're at your parents' house exactly right now. And I know that for you, as for many, these lockdowns have stretched your resources to the very limit. But, you know, you are fortunate. You have the support of parents. You also, I know, have a wonderful community of true friends. So tell me something about your own children. What ages are they, and how has the pandemic affected your children?
So my children range from Sol's the eldest, 13, Sebastian, 11, Luca, 6, and little Luna, 4. So I would say that, as you've said, I understand and acknowledge I am wildly privileged in having so much help from family, from a supportive network of friends, and very kind of well informed about therapeutic input. And the school that my children go to, I couldn't have asked for better support in terms of the teachers and the community and the philosophy. So I chose the school very with great intention, in that the main thing about it is the rhythm, the routine, lots of time in nature, lots of time creating and making. So for my children, all that being said, being alone with 4 children for the majority of the time is, of course, a challenge. It would be a challenge to anybody. But what I have seen is that there have been times when I would say the effect on my children, even with me having help, has been absolutely devastating. I would say, and I know that this isn't the case for all families, but the increased amount of time on screens, I have seen my oldest son's eyes just kind of glaze over. All he wants as a 13-year-old boy is to be with his friends, as all 13-year-olds, you know, like that's what he wants. He just wants to be out. They would love to be just going to the woods, going for a walk, having a laugh, going to get himself a vegan sausage roll, you know, just kind of like young, free pleasures. I would say that one of my children has kind of adapted quite well, because he likes doing his work. He's had a lot of good feedback from his teachers and the other children in his class. But for my two younger children, not having that routine, the rhythm that their kindergarten provides it's caused really negative effects, both emotionally in their behavior, which at times has just driven me to some very like shamefully ungentle parenting at times, and but also it's affected their ability to sleep, this kind of cycle of just needing the time maybe just to cook the dinner. So they're then with the screen, but they've not had enough time outside in nature that day. So they've been staying up late. So it's been very, very challenging for me. And I must say my saving grace has been having my parents to share that workload with. Because I am a single mother, I've been allowed within the rules to have support from my family, which is something that so many families don't have at all. So yeah, that's a kind of snapshot. And I would say that there's been times when my oldest son went into school. Now the school is a thriving and really imaginative, creative place. And he went in on one of the days and said that all the children were sitting in the library with earphones on, plugged into these computers. And the look across his face when he said it, it was like deeply unnerving for him, because it's the opposite to what that education would be about. And another, Sebastian, who's 11, he has said, he spoke a lot about feeling so sad for babies who've been born into this pandemic, and how they wouldn't have barely seen anybody's faces, seeing continually people with like masks across their faces. And I spoke to another lady in a group, and her child was reaching maybe 10 months of age, so had been in the pandemic all their life. And she had been considering whether she was suffering from postnatal depression when her baby hadn't seen anybody outside her and the father. And I thought to myself, it's really unlikely that that's, postnatal depression. It's much more likely that all of the joys of a new baby and the support that you would get from other mothers, other parents, that delight and joy and glee from, and that, being with the grandparents, all these things have been, systematically taken away.
The question is like, what's the long-term effect of that? Because that is a formative period in a child's life. So again, I'd like to make the point, it's not like, oh, hey, lockdowns end or we ease out of the pandemic, like it's not a problem anymore. Actually, we're going to be left with some very serious long-term imprints or issues that we can't even fully see right now. I would just like to be aware of that, to, like not be simplistic about this. And there may be like years to come where these things still need like healing and balancing and addressing on some level. Yeah. So I think, Katharine, I hope we've done a reasonable job like mapping some of these issues. I've read about like women arriving at hospitals to give birth, being told they can't have a birth partner, and here's a mask, put it on. How are you kind of like, when you're doing your breathing exercises trying to give birth, how can you do that with a mask on? That's like abuse to my mind. I can't even imagine such a scenario. But
totally agree. And also women who've really terribly received the horrific news that their baby has died in utero, and they have had to go through that process alone without their partner, and I totally echo what you're saying about the long-term and complex effects and sort of post-traumatic trauma that these situations are setting up. The untold damage is something that we are all going to have to work as a society to offer
exactly.
compassion. Yeah.
And I think that's what I want to capture now, because we had promised this was not just going to be a depressing video. I also know this video can't go on forever. You know, people are so busy right now coping with the pandemic and the extra demands of that. People don't have time to listen to a 3-hour recording. I completely get that. So what I would like to do now, Katharine, is to more, you and I, we also brainstormed about like what positive, constructive suggestions can we come up with. And you know, we can start with your ideas, and then I will share my ideas. But you know, even your children have come up with some ideas. So you know, this is the visioning conversation. Say okay, and also I just want to say one thing very, very clearly: none of these suggestions are meant to be instead of the government providing adequate, you know, like mental health and other care for children, families, and teenagers. So what we are more talking about is like the grassroots level, you know, the level of ourselves, society, and our communities, our tribe. What can we do? It's not meant to be instead of. It's not about letting public services off the hook and say that's okay now, you don't need to do anything. So I just want to be very, very clear about that. So having drawn that line, Katharine, could you share with me some ideas that you and your children have for the things that we can do and how we can move on this in a positive way?
So one of the first things that sort of rose up for me when I started to think about actual positive steps forward was that last year we were living in the summer in a temporary accommodation, and I came across a scheme called Edible York, where anyone can volunteer for this. So outside your house, you'll have a little stall where there will be seeds, maybe some half-started plants like tomatoes, courgettes, little pots, and you know, and earth available, and you just sort of offer this to the community where you are. So it's extremely simple, but what we found was that this brought so much joy, both to us in terms of the simplicity and the magic of planting seeds and then seeing them start to grow. So in the terms of everything around us was very uncertain and unsure. Nobody knew what was happening. You know, people were sort of kept to some extent within their houses. But just this simple thing of planting seeds and watching them grow was its own real magic. And then we had a little family from down the road who'd taken a plant. They sent us a beautiful card with a rainbow on saying thank you so much. And then they sent us back pumpkin seeds to plant from their grandmother. And it was a way of giving something freely, and this real beautiful gift had been returned. And it felt like there's something about trusting in the process of nature, trusting in the process of, you know, life and death, and that the seeds would sprout, that felt absolutely healing. And the other thing that I've been thinking about a great deal is that, and obviously, Imelda, you've got one in your own garden, the wishing tree, of tying.
We've got prayer tree.
Tying the ribbons to trees. And I've been thinking, it was very difficult for me. I had a real resistance. I love to be in a group. I love to hug people, you know, with permission, but I love to be close to people. And moving any of my work online was a real challenge to me. But once we'd done it, we found that sending out kind of sacred items is a way of really connecting with that and creating kind of altars wherever you are. And the ribbons in trees, I was thinking a lot about the Festival of Beltane, which is all about the kind of, you know, the male and the female energy, and it's really a sacred fertility rite, but it's a very ancient tradition in these parts is to have the maypole and the ribbons around it. And thinking about potentially having rainbow ribbons and having children to attach them in trees, leave a wish for themselves, maybe a wish for a passerby. And then actually I am really thinking about finding ways of attaching little bags of organic seeds for people to take with them, really as a gesture of hope. so that we are all together planting the seeds and the dreams of a better future, and of one that involves growth. And I think for me, it's very important that these would be organic seeds, because that is a way of honouring nature herself. Yeah.
That's beautiful. I really hope that will come off. May it spread to cities all over the world and places everywhere. I think that's beautiful.
And I'm thinking of starting that kind of locally and small, with my own family and other families that I'm working with, setting up a Rebel Girls group, and that we might actually take it up on board ourselves to send out these kits to other children. And I think that then we could perhaps have a record of it, and a sort of map that maybe could be shared online somehow of how that was spreading. And to me, that would be both a physical picture of these seeds of hope and growth spreading, as well as a practical one. So I think that's what I really kind of settled on. And another thing that's just kind of is that all of the work that I've ever done has been underpinned by the person-centered principles, which is that you offer somebody empathy, unconditional positive regard, fancy word for love, really, a kind of just like a loving environment, and non-judgmentalness, and that we trust that every person who we ever meet is the expert on him or herself. Now, this remains a radical prospect for whatever reasons, but I just think that if everywhere we go, whether that's to the park or crossing the road or taking our shopping out, if we can offer our presence to somebody so that when they speak of how they are, we can really hear them, that is a gift. And still, it's a rare gift, and it's something that each of us can do. Really simple. How are you? Oh, you're missing your friends from school. And just that acknowledgement of how we are. A connection as human beings has never been more important, I think.
Yeah, and as you know from all the, we've done like sacred art retreats and shamanic training modules at my house, and what we always see there is the power of witnessing. And I've seen so many examples of that in all the locations where I've taught courses, that the moment you have a powerful group of people who really put themselves aside and really witness what goes on with another person, like say in ceremonies where we take turns, or sharing when we take turns, and like the healing power of just that, where like you're seen on the level of soul by your community, be it your like community who lives around you, or be it more sort of focused communities who get together for a reason or a shared interest. And you're absolutely right, and that is like something that only human beings can give to other human beings, and it does not require a formal setting. This is something we can really like take out in the world. That gift of being fully present to another person, and not always trying to get our own story in there first, but like listen as much as you talk, and like really sort of push your own concerns out of the way. Like try to really tune into what's going on with the person in front of you. And as Katharine says, don't judge them for it, so they feel safe enough to actually open up and share that. Because the moment the person feels judged, like they're going to be editing, or they're going to be hiding, or wearing a mask. So I think these are wonderful ideas.
The very, very last thing that I would like to say, which is that something that you've taught me, Imelda, so you know it only too well, but that for anybody who, because we've both acknowledged that the absolutely most vulnerable people are very unlikely to be sitting watching this at home. The very people who we might feel most concerned for. But that it is so important that whenever we engage in whatever our own sacred work is, whenever we make prayers or create ceremony or create ritual, that we send out that healing love, that healing energy, wherever it is wanted, needed, and welcomed. And that can be to all the children living in every refugee camp upon this earth, all of the children who are without these basic essentials that they deserve. And I always send that intentional healing love to everybody who's doing this work, be it in the world of spirit or on the earthly plane. And also holding a vision of each and every child, young person and adult in their divinity and their wholeness, not sending the energy of sympathy or pity, which you've taught us very well is of no use to anybody. So I think that would be my final kind of plea to anybody who does any form of spiritual work, is to involve all our community and our wider community, and maybe the parts of community that we don't see in that.
Yeah, no, and that's an excellent piece, and thank you for bringing it. And I can just explain it like a little bit more in case someone thinks, hey, but what is that? The thing is that the moment we feel pity for a person, you know, it's like in shamanism we say that we focus on growth. So like the moment we worry about a person or we feel pity for them, inadvertently we're empowering the very thing we would not wish for that person. And that's been a shift that, you know, like I have learned from my own teachers, especially Sandra Eamon. And it's something that I really have spent years sort of monitoring in myself. And now when these things unfold, I really make it an act of will, you know, to focus on the positive. So rather than saying, oh, poor person, you know, I really choose to see that person having the strength and the resources and the support to deal with the situation. And also when I speak to people, I try to make comments that reflect that. You know, so I try not to go at people and say, oh, poor thing. Because, you know, it may be nice for people to have that bit of sympathy, but at the end of the day, it doesn't help anything. And, you know, so there's quite a lot of stuff there. That could be a whole different recording. We won't do that now, you know, about how we actually use language and how we actually mirror back to other people what goes on for them. But that is the thing. If you're going to be talking to a person, or if you find yourself worrying about people, what you're really doing on the most basic level, you're using energy. You're expending or spending energy. So think again about how that same energy can be used. It can be used to power better outcomes for the person that your focus is on. That's it, right? Yeah. Okay. Now, I had also tried to come up with some ideas. Like for about a week, I wanted to do this recording with Katharine, and I felt quite, you know, burdened by all the things I observed happening in the world around me. And I thought, well, if I can't come up with any positive suggestions, there's no point making a recording. Last thing I want to do is add to the collective sense of overwhelm and grief. So that really took me a week to sort of, you know, like same principle again, like, you know, focus on the positive, focus on what you do want to grow in the world. So here were some ideas that I came up with. And, you know, I used to run a shamanic group program for children called the Time Travelers. You know, most of them are at university now, and also I could be busy with other things. I'm not doing it right now anymore, though I still get people who ask if their children can come to the Time Travelers, but send them to other people running similar groups. And there it got to the point where at some point we had, you know, the teenagers and also the younger children working together. And I was like trying to encourage the older ones to be mentors for the younger ones. And again, we're not shoving the psychological and emotional well-being of younger children solely in the care of older children. That could easily be abused, that idea. That's not how I how I mean it. But I do believe that if we give older children, and that could even be siblings, or that could be in schools, or that could be more informally in communities, or that could be in churches or whatever, we give, you know, older children, if we agree with them, and I've seen this done as programs in like the school my children attended, if we give them that responsibility and they willingly do it, we don't just foist it on them, but we ask them if they might be willing to do that, and we give them the support and we give them the space to debrief from it. I think where, you know, slightly older children who have an experience of something that younger children are just like starting, they're just like entering the territories, that can be remarkably effective. I've seen children be really fantastic mentors for other children. And like that's the thing that our eldest son, Quinn, has always done for his two younger brothers. You know, like in some ways, his son is more like an uncle than a brother. He will also go in there and say, I think so-and-so needs a mentoring session. I'm going to like, grabbing this evening when the house is quiet. And it's like so fantastic to see how one of your children, and I know, our eldest son, Quinn, he does that in the world around him as well. That's the kind of person he is. But, to really see how that works and to see how sometimes his brothers open up to him about things that they don't necessarily as teenagers want to share with a parent. So that I think is an area where, much can be done. And the same thing I think goes for adults. Adults can also, and here I'm talking about without any expectation of payment or a reward. So you could call this giving back, or you could call this just like participating in life and like making a difference in the place where you are. But if those adults who felt willing to do it and had the headspace to do it, would make a commitment to mentoring one child that's not their own child. So one child in their immediate community or another community, football club, church, or whatever it is, or a child that you hear about, that you share a quirky interest with, or whatever it is. But if we could get to a situation where, a large number of adults would say, yeah, I can do that. I can make that commitment to be a mentor for just one child, be that listening ear, non-judgmental listener, someone who will make time available when the child needs something. So they have that one safe person they can go to. And it's not patient-like therapy where it's only like once a week or once a month, where you get 6 months in the health service besides if you up your budget. But if that could be a more long-term relationship where the child could rely on it and know it's going to be there, I think these kind of like mentoring relationships can be immensely supportive and healing. And then the third group that I was thinking about, because Katharine, you talked about you are like lucky, obviously, and we have your grandparents babysitting, so you and I can make a recording. So we're benefiting from this right now. But as she said correctly, I haven't seen my mother in the Netherlands for like almost a year. I haven't seen my mother-in-law in Sweden because I can't get there for almost a year. So my children haven't seen their grandparents. We've not been able to shift them across the borders and get them there. And also then there's the whole thing, even if you could see the grandparents, you might be infecting them with COVID. So like that whole situation is playing out. And it's been for good reason that young people have made sacrifices to protect their elders. But now with vaccinations being rolled out and the mood shifting, hopefully, I very much hope that more could be done to team up young people and elderly people, because, we live in a society that's very aging phobic, and old or older, more elderly people in our society are often given the feeling that they're past their sell-by date or of no real use anymore, which is dreadful. B, it is nonsense. When COVID started, suddenly there were calls for retired doctors and nurses to actually re-enter the field and please go back to work. So I think, that blew out of the water, that whole idea of old people not making a contribution. So I think when younger generations and older people can more safely spend time together again, observing all the, the guidelines around that, if we could team young people up with elderly people, elderly people might have loneliness issues or might have issues feeling that they have so many skills and love to share and that maybe they can't, or maybe their own grandchildren are far away or whatever it is. And then we have children who are in dire need of, a mentor or even an honorary fairy grandmother or grandfather in their lives. So if we could bring these groups together, and also often the people in the grandparent generation, will have a larger time budget than the people who are and parenting and working and paying bills and looking after houses and, and all of that and holding down their professional life as well as parenting. So that is another, another group. So I think if we could promote that, or I don't know how to do that, or how formal to make such a project, or just to launch it as an idea for ID, but we really could get that kind of mentoring off the ground. That is something that will not cost money. It will just require input, like time and energy. But I also do believe that could, it will not solve, it's never instead of proper mental health care. But I do think it could make a tremendous difference to the lives and well-being of many young people. What do you say, Katharine?
I would just like to come in on that really and say that 2 summers ago, I took all my children and my 2 stepdaughters to a beautiful festival. And at this festival, there was a red tent, but there was also a grandmother's tent. And in this beautiful grandmother's tent, there were these beautiful grandmothers, and they sat with all the patience in the world, teaching the children to crochet. I took 2 of my children with me, and then they taught us a beautiful song. And honestly, that was the bit that stood out. It was Sebastian and Sienna that went in that tent, and that stood out to them as like the highlight of the festival.
Wow.
And the imparting of skills, wisdom, songs, the old ways. This is what so many of us miss when we're in more kind of isolated, what do they call it, like nuclear families maybe, or people in different countries. But this, what we have to offer each other, what the grandmothers, the great grandmothers, the granddads have to offer the children, the younger generation, and also having that. They seem to me to have more trust in time. They're not in a rush,
Exactly. A bit more time rich, that bit less rushed. I mean, makes all the difference. Yeah. So that's what we need, and you've solved it. We need grandmother and grandfather tents all over our communities. Not necessarily red tents, maybe there could be rainbow. No, I love that idea. And, I think, and that should be doable. If more people see that that's the way forward, I think that is doable to make that happen. And I think that's not just one-way traffic. I think that will also really add a dimension to the people who are doing the volunteering as the grandmothers and the grandfathers and the armies of aunties and uncles and very godparents.
Absolutely.
So, and I think maybe the last thing I want to say is something you also pointed out recently, Katharine, that of course when I wrote my first book, which was Leisure Born Shamans, that was very much about work where, because it was in-depth shamanic work and toolkit work, the parents had to give permission for that work to be done. And now, of course, people associate me with that book as the author of that book. So what I want to say on my own part is what I'm talking about here is completely non-denominational. It's not even about spiritual toolkit work. That's like a different thing again. I really believe in that as well, and I'm committed to that. But what I'm talking about here in this video with Katharine is about human presence, about being there for another human being. It's mentoring, and for me, there is no real spiritual or religious or whatever dimension to that. And it could hopefully even work right across, denominational divides. See no reasons why, say, you name it. Say a white UK grandpa couldn't work with a Muslim boy and they both learn something about each other's culture, or maybe a few words in different languages, or they get to sort of participate in a festival they don't normally see. And that would then also, with the whole mood post-Brexit, maybe add to that sense of community and respectful cultural exchange. And there's so many other themes there that really require attention. So, what I'm really promoting, I guess, is a kind of almost a return to a more, shall we say, tribal cohesion and structure, something we observe in indigenous tribes, who have always lived in intergenerational ways and in a very reciprocal relationship with Mother Earth as well. And that takes us back to you talking about these beautiful seeds and the little pouches hanging in trees, and people planting seeds and then sort of leaving you some seeds in return. We're back to the whole seed planting idea. So I think, Katharine, that brings us to the end of the session. I think maybe your parents need some help now with their 2 younger ones. I don't know what's going on there. Any closing words for you before we finish or before we close the recording?
I think my prayer would be that these seeds of love, of hope, of growth, and of respecting the wisdom of the generations, the ancestors and the descendants, I hope these all come to grow, to fruit and to blossom.
Yeah. And on the positive side, I think it's entirely possible. It's just going to require all of us. It's something we can only do together. With like a powerful human teaching, we can't do much on our own, but when we all work together, these things are actually possible. And that is a message of hope. Okay, well, thank you everyone who's listening to this in their own time. And if you have really good ideas, do write in or join the Healing Wise group. We would like to hear about them, Katharine, don't we? If people have really good additional ideas, let's start mapping them. Let's start writing them down, like make them available as resources for people who are looking for ways of making a difference. And also, Katharine, as your ideas expand and as lockdown now hopefully eases, according to our Prime Minister, maybe we could talk again in a number of months' time and sort of hear how some of these projects are going. Yeah?
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yay.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being here today and organizing childcare and all. And also, please say thank you to your parents for looking after the children so we could even do this.
Thank you.